Hey, all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 15, Section 4, which really kind of wraps up our overview of how the Cold War began and kind of how it led to all these tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so to start off, today we're going to be talking about President Eisenhower and how really President Truman served unofficially 2 terms in office. He considered his first term to be FDR's, 4th term in office, and then he was elected to his own term. But he had a lot of trouble in that second term. He really felt like the Korean War was a failure because it ended in that stalemate at the 30th parallel, because we were unable to stop the spread of communism in China and in North Korea. And so his self-confidence was down, and he decided not to run for another term. So in that next election, we're going to see that General Eisenhower is elected. And Eisenhower is going to win in a landslide up against the Democratic candidate of Adlai Stevenson. The reason that Eisenhower wins is because, of course, people were kind of angry with the Democratic Party. They felt like they weren't having a successful policy at stopping communism. They were blaming Truman and the party. And so they were looking for a change. They haven't had a Republican president in power, since Herbert Hoover left in 1931. So, we haven't had a Republican president in years, in 2 decades. So Eisenhower is going to get elected, and it was kind of only made logical sense that he would get elected since he was the war hero of World War II. He was the commander of the American troops in Africa and then, in Europe, and he was in charge of that D-Day invasion. So people really kind of see him as, the hero who can save America, who can get us on the right track. So make sure today that you watch the president clip about Eisenhower so that you can watch it under classwork and write down your 5 facts about him. So as Eisenhower comes to power, one of the things that he feels is that America needs a strong economy. He feels that, the best way to stop the spread of communism is by having a key economy, a strong economy, that if Americans are in poverty, if Americans are not working, if unemployment is high, then yes, people might consider turning to communism. But he said that if the government does its job, if it's able to give small businesses and large businesses loans, if they're able to, build new buildings and hire new people and come up with new advertising campaigns, if they're creating products, capitalism will work the way that it's intended, and they'll hire people, people will be working, they'll save money, but they'll also spend money, which will then in turn create more jobs. So he said the best way to really kind of stop the spread of communism is to show the world that capitalism is working, that America is successful, that its economy is on track. So he's going to really kind of put into place all sorts of reforms to try to help small businesses and to get Americans working, to make sure unemployment is low. This is going to be a very difficult time to be an American, where if you're a woman, it's not a great time to be in the workplace. There really has this expectation, again, that women should be at home taking care of their families. If women are working, it's expected that it's only because they're single or because they're widowed. There's definitely a lot of gender discrimination in the workplace as far as how you are treated and what's expected of you and how you're going to be paid. It's really a society. Remember last time we talked about the Red Scare and how there was this fear that communists were living amongst us. So there is definitely this push for conformity, and it's definitely a couples society. And if you look different or act different, people aren't going to hang around with you. They're going to ostracize you. If you would dare even consider, if you're unhappily married, getting divorced, then you're definitely going to be ostracized. There is, a definite kind of thought process that after the war, the GIs come home and they get married, they have children. 97% of all marriageable people were married. They have kids, which is the baby boom generation. And then as those kids, grow to be teenagers, people move out to the suburbs, away from the cities. They move into houses that all look like each other in Levittown. And as their kids grow, perhaps they start listening to the new rock and roll of Elvis Presley and of the new generation, and people are watching TV more than ever, trying to buy these consumer goods to make their life easier. Now, in terms of his Cold War policy, Eisenhower's a little bit different. He's a career military man, and he says keeping a large standing army around forever, the way that we had in World War II, is going to cost so much money. And he says that he understands why we need it, because we're basically unofficially at war with the Soviet Union, and now that, they've created their own atomic bomb, and we've created an H-bomb, and now they're working to create their own H-bomb, we could have a nuclear war on our hands, so we need to be prepared. And he understands the reason why people would want to have a huge army, but at the same time, that's going to cost so much money. It's going to drain our funds, and then as our economy perhaps will suffer, it'll mean higher taxes, people will have a lower standard of living, and then perhaps people would want to become communist. So yet again, it goes back to his main idea that the best way to stop communism is to fix our economy at home. So he has kind of a different idea. He says, decrease the size of the regular army, basically change up the kinds of weapons that we're using. And he really and truly supports the use of nuclear weapons. And maybe that's because, he was in World War II and he saw the amount of casualties and how people, are going to die quickly in battle. And so Japan, of course, was quick to surrender after the use of a nuclear weapon. And so he says, if we have to threaten nuclear war, then so be it. But we'll threaten nuclear war. He was willing to threaten it, and he says that by having all these nuclear weapons, it will be a deterrence. It will stop people from wanting to fight us. So his policy is all about massive retaliation, and he says, let's build up our nuclear weapons, let's build up our arsenal, and this will be a huge deterrence. No one will want to attack us because they'll know that we might nuke them in return. And so this policy is called his Brinkmanship. You're really willing to go to the brink of war in order to get what you want, to force a country to negotiate with you. And this is going to be very, very clear in Asia. He becomes very worried that Mao Zedong is going to try to take control of Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek is living, which is the nationalist government that we recognize as the true Chinese government. And so yet again, he threatens them with nuking China. And so China steps down. He is willing to go to war. Some people say this is effective because it decreases the size of our military and it scares other countries. It forces them to be complacent. Other people really question the thought process here. Why are you going to, threaten nuclear war every time? It's more like the boy who cried wolf. Eventually we'll have to drop an atomic bomb or no one's going to take us seriously. My screen is froze. There we go. Now, John Doles is our Secretary of State during this time period, and he says the ability to get to the verge without getting into war is the necessary art. If you cannot master it, you inevitably get into war. If you try to run away from it, if you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost. So he really is a gambler of sorts and says that we can use this policy effectively, and him and Eisenhower are kind of on the same page. He obviously does get criticized heavily for it, but a lot of people do like this policy, and it does keep America, at least out of Eisenhower's term in office, it does officially keep us out of war. But Eisenhower is still incredibly worried that America might go to war at any time. He still puts out government propaganda films, encouraging people to buy bomb shelters. He creates the Federal Highway Act, so the reason that we have, Route 66 and highways across America, as Americans are becoming more obsessed with cars and building drive-ins and fast food and, drive-in movies. He builds that federal highway system, not so Americans can travel. They might think that to build up our economy, but in all reality, he builds it up because he knows that if there was a nuclear attack, we need to be able to ship troops and nuclear weapons across the country in a hurry. Now, he also, during this time period, is going to create the first ICBM, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, because he wants to be able to, he says, well, what happens if, all these countries that are in Western Europe that are on the west side of the Iron Curtain are currently free, but what if they do get attacked by the Russians? What if they're no longer free? I want to still be able to attack Russia. And so they're creating bigger and better weapons with the help of the defense industry. And Eisenhower will later kind of caution Americans against this and say the U.S. military has become so reliant on technology and on defense programs and scientists. And there is this connection, and perhaps these defense contractors have too much power in America and in the world. And he warns against kind of the military-industrial complex. But yeah, we are creating these new bombs so that we can launch an attack across a whole continent, from the United States across Europe all the way to get to Russia, so that Stalin knows he is not safe. Now, as we are creating these new weapons, and this arms race is really heating up in the Cold War, even though we're not officially fighting them, we're putting out a new weapon, we're showing the world, we're testing it, we're kind of showing them what we have, kind of showing off and scaring them. Russia is doing the same thing, and Russia is going to be the first country to launch a satellite into orbit, which is really going to create a lot of fear amongst Americans, because we're going to really start to fear that, okay, if they can put a satellite into orbit, could they somehow launch a nuclear bomb into orbit? Could they somehow put guns on the moon and attack us? What could they do?
They say, attention, all radio stations of the Soviet Union are broadcasting.
The first artificial Earth satellites in the world have now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched.
This beep, 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 what is it? Sputnik. Sputnik is around the globe. Who did it? We did it. The Soviet Union. First in the space. And I can remember going out to my backyard one night, looking up at this bright streak going across the sky, and I felt a sudden sinking feeling, one of almost terror. Now, suddenly, you got Soviet missiles that can reach into the Dakotas, can hit Chicago.
With a surprise attack possible for the first time, Americans began to look at the sky differently, now as a place from which terror might reign, and to learn some new terms like duck and cover.
I felt that the threat to America had been increased, that the Soviet Union had upped the ante. While we were playing Cops and Robbers hide and seek in our backyards and our front yards, there was the gnawing anxiety that it could all end instantaneously.
So as I was saying, yeah, the Soviets create this Sputnik, this first satellite into space, and it definitely launches fears. And so Americans then become obsessed with getting our own satellite into space. The Soviets quickly afterwards create Sputnik 2 by 1957. Later that year, they launched Sputnik 2. This time around, they actually launched a dog into space as well named Laika. And it was known that there was no way that Laika was going to make it back to Earth. Like, that was part of their initial program. But it was just to see, how long basically Laika would survive. Now, in today's world, we definitely would think, this is unethical. But other countries don't have the same standards as the United States, but many space programs have launched animals into space because they wanted to launch animals first to see how they lasted, how they did, how long they survived before they would put humans into space. But Laika, unfortunately, they knew there was going to be no possibility of it making it back to Earth. But this really starts to put a fire under Americans that we need to create our own satellites. We need to get people into space. We need to get a man on the moon, which is what JFK is going to become obsessed with as he gets elected in 1960. Now, as Soviet tensions are heating up, we really start to realize that, okay, we have the FBI in America, which is going to be protecting Americans at home, and it's looking for, perhaps people who not just have, communist sympathies, but are perhaps actually spies, like we mentioned Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg last time. So they're kind of looking at domestic efforts to try to fight communism, but they also are going to need another organization to try to fight communists. So at this point in time, Eisenhower officially creates the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And this kind of goes along with the idea of the Truman Doctrine, which you're going to do anything and everything to fight communism. Remember, and it's not just about always fighting with the military. It's about fighting by giving a country financial support, like we did with the Marshall Plan, or food, like we did with the Berlin Airlift. And this time it's going to be really about overthrowing their governments. So we were very interested in Iran, for example. It seemed like the people were going to choose a new Shah, a new leader, and he had communist sympathies, and perhaps he was going to sell some of their oil to the communists. Perhaps he was going to convince the people to become communists, or basically just force them to become communists because he was a dictator of sorts. And so what we do was pretty awful. We are meddling. We go ahead and, as the CIA, we bring in people who are unofficially sanctioned, and they're going to bring in money and guns and supplies, just like you see in spy movies, and they're going to sneak them into Iran, and they're going to give them to basically gangs, people who are revolutionaries, terrorists of sorts who want to overthrow the government, and we basically help them to overthrow their government, to take out their new Shah. And we kind of suggest through money and through perhaps force and violence, plus they have some of the same goals as us, that they're going to put someone else in power who is more supportive of democracy and capitalism. And we do this all over the world, in Guatemala, time and time again. But at the same time, you can kind of understand why we're doing this, because at this point in time, Joseph Stalin dies. And Nikita Khrushchev becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he is just as brutal. He makes some speeches as he comes to power, saying that he's going to change some of the policies of Stalin, that communism doesn't have to function the way it always did under Stalin. And so some countries in Eastern Europe, some of the satellite nations like Hungary, take that as perhaps we can have more freedom, perhaps we can rebel and no longer be a satellite nation, perhaps we don't have to be part of this Warsaw Pact. But that's not the case. In fact, Khrushchev is going to crush those revolts, kill as many people as possible, and show them that he is boss. And so, you know, even though we have a new leader in the Soviet Union, communism is still alive and well. They're trying to still spread communism. They're still willing to use violence. And so, you know, in some ways, we understand why Eisenhower was willing to use illegal means with the CIA to stop communism from spreading in some of these other countries and to follow this policy of containment. Now, one of the other things that happens during this time period is that going along with the Middle East, we start to see a lot more drama unfolding in Egypt. And the people in Egypt want to build a dam to raise money, and they're really angry that the British and the French, you know, for the past 100 years have owned and controlled the Suez Canal. So basically, to create money to, you know, they decide to overthrow the British and French, take control of the Suez Canal. You know, that way they can have money to build their dam, and they say the British and the French don't have any rights to this since it's not their country. The British and the French think about going to war over this. The Russians decide to get involved, and they support the Egyptian goal for independence and kind of to control the Suez Canal. The Russians are also very supportive of the new leader of Egypt, who is named Nasser, who's all about pan-Arabism, kind of connecting different groups in Egypt together and throughout the Middle East, and perhaps spreading communism. And so yet again, we don't know what to do here, but it seemed very likely that a nuclear war was possible. The Russians were threatening it, and so Eisenhower was threatening it as well, him and John Dole, saying that they were going to attack anyone and everyone. And so at this point, Eisenhower comes out with his official Eisenhower Doctrine, which says we will use military force if necessary to resist communism, you know, in the Middle East. It's basically an extension of the Truman Doctrine from Europe and Asia into the Middle East now, saying we're going to fight it anywhere and everywhere. Now, eventually, to avoid nuclear war, we actually do step down in this case. We convince the British and the French not to attack, to stay out of it, to basically relinquish control of that canal, to give it back to the Egyptians. And as we step down, the Soviets step down, and the Egyptians gain control of their canal, which is probably the way it should be. But the British and the French were very angry. You know, Great Britain had a new queen at this point. Queen Elizabeth II had been in power only about 10 years. And so she was young, trying to figure out how to rule the country. But war was avoided, at least another World War III. But tensions were really increasing there. And it seemed like tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets were constantly blowing up, which is why the United States invited Khrushchev to come to America and to come to D.C. and to meet Eisenhower. And Eisenhower basically posed it and said, look, I'm new to this job, you're new to this job, perhaps we can sit down and talk issues out. Well, America had secretly been flying over Russia. We had these new long-range B-52 bombers, which we still use today, which could drop a nuclear bomb, and we were taking more and more aerial shots and views over Russia, trying to figure out how many nuclear weapons they were producing and where they moving them and what they were up to. And what ends up happening was that eventually Eisenhower said, I don't think we should do this anymore. I think we're going to get caught. I think it's going to lead to war. Plus, I have Khrushchev coming, and I told him we're going to talk things out and try to put our countries on a better path. Well, John Dole, our Secretary of State, encouraged, the president to have one more final mission. And so Gary Powers, the man you see in the picture, flies one more U-2 spy plane across Russia. And as he's taking pictures, he gets shot down and he gets captured. And Khrushchev basically comes to Washington, D.C., and he starts asking Eisenhower about this. Eisenhower makes the mistake of lying to Khrushchev, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. And then he produces Gary Powers and images of him, and then Eisenhower's like, whoops, yeah, sorry, I was spying on you. I got to admit it. And then Khrushchev called off the conference. So those attempts at peace quickly come to an end. And so, as I kind of said before, Eisenhower, at the end of his term, he basically decides that he's done. You know, he did one term. He says, I'm old, I'm retiring. Let somebody new come into this job. And he does warn, you know, against about one policy. He says, you know, you're going to probably have to use multiple policies to try to stop this Cold War. It doesn't seem like there's just one good method, but we definitely need to keep our economy strong. We definitely need to consider the nuclear option, but maybe we need to go back to more standard troops. But he says you need to really be careful of the fact that we have this huge growing defense industry, which is making all these military weapons and military contractors who are working along with our military and have secrets and have all this power. They could perhaps become a threat to our peace in the future.
Therefore, propaganda is vastly more important in democratic societies.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may.
So just to wrap up, I just wanted to show you that clip. I meant to show it to you earlier. Even as Eisenhower was coming to, out of office, he still was putting out propaganda warning Americans against communism. All right, so that wraps us up for today. The rest of class, what we're going to be doing is watching a little video clip about happy days or life in the 1950s in terms of pop culture stuff like Elvis Presley and popular music. Make sure you complete exit slip number 4 based off this lecture, where you talk about some of the new things you learned today and some of the things you learned from maybe the President's video or from the Century video. Happy days. Have a great day, guys, and if you need help, let me know. That's it for now.